The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just a fluke. My solar meter had blinked a warning, a faint, almost imperceptible red light that made my stomach twist. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a glitch, a momentary hiccup in the system. But then it happened again, and again. Every day my solar energy, the clean power I worked years to install on my roof, was being siphoned away, drained like someone had found a secret line into my home. And it wasn't just anyone, it was her. HOA Karen. I still remember the look on her face the first time I caught her. Smug, entitled, a grin that seemed to say, I can do whatever I want and you'll just sit there and watch. She had somehow found a way to plug her brand new Tesla into my solar grid, my electricity, my investment, my work. And she did it like it was nothing, like it was her right. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pure white-hot anger mixed with disbelief. How could someone be so brazen, so careless with other people's property? And yet, even as my frustration boiled, a small part of me knew that whatever I did next had to be calculated. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a challenge, a provocation. Every day, I would check the meter obsessively, watching the numbers climb faster than they should, seeing the energy I generated disappear into her car. The neighborhood had always seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, with perfectly trimmed lawns and quiet streets. But now, that calm veneer had shattered. Every polite smile from my neighbors felt hollow. Every small-town nod in passing seemed layered with unspoken questions. Did you see what happened? Can you believe it? I couldn't tell anyone yet, not until I knew how deep this went, but the tension was gnawing at me. Relentless and electric HOA Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, who read rules like they were suggestions, who believed that the world, or at least our neighborhood, was hers to manipulate. She would make little digs at community meetings, enforce rules selectively, and wield fines like weapons. I had dealt with petty HOA politics before, sure, but nothing had ever crossed this line. And now, with her Tesla literally drinking from my solar panels, it wasn't just about money or energy, it was about pride, fairness, and the principle that my home and hard work weren't open for anyone's exploitation. I tried to reason with her. I left notes, subtle reminders, hoping maybe she hadn't realized the impact. But the very next day there it was again, the unmistakable hum of her car charging. I could almost hear her smug laughter through the walls. And that's when it hit me, she wasn't going to stop. Not unless I made her. Not unless I took control of the situation in a way she would never see coming. The idea started forming slowly at first, a flicker of possibility. What if I could turn this around? What if I could fight back, but in a way that would be unforgettable, undeniable, and utterly shocking? The tension in the neighborhood was rising. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of who owed what, who was bending the rules, who was overstepping. And all of it seemed to center on one central, ridiculous, infuriating truth. One woman was exploiting a system she had no right to touch, and the rest of us were powerless to stop her, except maybe me. I spent nights thinking, planning, feeling. The anger twisted into something sharper, something clever. The thrill of the challenge began to mix with my frustration. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was about making a statement, a lesson. Something that would ripple through the HOA, through the neighborhood. Something that would make everyone pay attention to just how far she had overstepped. And then the moment came, the one I had been waiting for. Whether I realized it fully or not, I watched her pull into the driveway, Tesla humming with borrowed energy. I knew what I had to do. I could almost feel the electric tension in the air, the kind that makes your skin tingle and your heart race, the kind that tells you a storm is coming. A confrontation was inevitable. And when it happened, it wouldn't just be about electricity or rules or petty HOA squabbles. It would be about principle, audacity, and finally, justice. The question now isn't whether I act, it's what I do next. Will I confront her head-on, risk a public meltdown, or play a more subtle game, setting the stage for a shocking revelation she'll never forget? Every option carries a risk, every choice a consequence. But one thing is certain, the quiet peace of our little neighborhood is gone, and nothing will ever be the same again. So I watched. I waited. And I wondered, how far would she go before someone finally made her pay? How far would I go to make sure she did? The answer, when it comes, will shock everyone, including her. Before the chaos started, life in our neighborhood felt almost perfect. We had moved into this quiet cul-de-sac 5 years ago, drawn by the charm of tree-lined streets, neatly painted houses, and the promise of a community where kids could play freely. Neighbors waved at one another, and Sunday morning smelled of fresh coffee and cut grass. Our house wasn't huge, but it had everything we wanted: a sun-soaked backyard, a garage that doubled as a workshop, and a roof strong enough to support the solar panels we had painstakingly installed. It wasn't just about saving money on electricity, it was about living responsibly, creating a home that aligned with our values. Our mornings were simple but joyful. I'd step out to check the panels, a small ritual that grounded me, knowing that each ray of sunlight was quietly fueling our home. My partner, Alex, would be in the kitchen, already humming a tune as he brewed coffee, while our daughter, Emily, ran around collecting her backpack and sneakers, ready for school. The neighborhood dogs would bark in the distance, neighbors would wave from across the street, and for a few calm minutes, everything seemed just right. It was a rhythm of normalcy that made this community feel like more than just a collection of houses. It felt like home. We weren't the loudest or flashiest residents. We didn't host extravagant block parties or insist on planting flowers that clashed with the HOA's prescribed color palette. We kept to ourselves, waved when we needed to, and contributed quietly to the little things that kept a neighborhood running smoothly. But quiet doesn't always mean safe. And sometimes, being careful and conscientious makes you the perfect target for someone who thrives on control. That someone, as it would soon become painfully clear, was Karen. HOA Karen. She was a fixture in the community long before we arrived. Everyone knew her, or at least knew of her. She wasn't malicious in an obvious, cartoonish way, at least not at first glance. She dressed impeccably, had a flawless garden that made every other lawn look a little shabby, and always seemed to be present at every neighborhood meeting, every committee vote, every minor discussion about fencing, signage, or holiday decorations. But there was an unmistakable edge to her personality, a sense that if she could bend rules, bend people, or bend situations to her will, she would. And that edge, sharp and invisible, would soon slice right through the calm fabric of our lives. Before the conflict began, Karen and her family seemed harmless enough. She drove a shiny Tesla, her husband spent hours tinkering in their pristine garage, and their kids, like ours, played on the cul-de-sac, tossing balls and chasing scooters. From the outside, it was picture-perfect suburban life. But Karen had a reputation for subtle intimidation. A misplaced comment here, a suggestion about community standards there, or a thinly veiled warning at an HOA meeting could send a ripple of anxiety through the most confident residents. People smiled, nodded, and carried on, but privately. Many feared her influence and the small army of rules she wielded like weapons. In those early days, I noticed small things that now seem like warning signs. The HOA newsletters were meticulous to a fault, detailing fines for things that seemed trivial: a cracked mailbox, a lawn slightly too high, a trash can left out for a few hours too long. At first, it was almost laughable, reading the extensive lists of do's and don'ts, the rigid color codes for shutters, the precise specifications for garden stones. But the humor faded quickly once I started realizing that some residents, even longtime members, had been on the receiving end of those rules and the consequences many times. And then I began seeing the subtle power plays: Karen offering advice that sounded friendly but carried implicit pressure, other neighbors quietly whispering about past disputes, the occasional harsh reminder that the HOA didn't tolerate exceptions. Still, life for us remained largely undisturbed. We were busy with work, school runs, and the small joys of daily life. Emily's laughter echoed across the driveway as she perfected her skateboard tricks. Alex was buried in a new woodworking project in the garage, and I spent evenings tending the garden, trimming the edges, adjusting the solar panels to catch the last golden rays. Everything seemed ordinary, almost mundane, but beneath that calm surface, the undercurrents of control and subtle competition were already swirling. Our first hint that something more serious might be brewing didn't come with yelling or confrontation, it came with a seemingly innocent question. Karen stopped by one afternoon while I was checking the panels, her sunglasses perched high, a clipboard in hand. "You know," she said, her tone light, almost casual, "it's wonderful that you're using solar, but have you read the HOA? Guidelines about energy equipment connections? We like to ensure all systems are approved and properly monitored for the safety of the neighborhood." It was such a harmless statement on the surface that I almost laughed. Approval? Monitoring? I had installed everything according to the code. But there was something in her gaze, something in the way she tapped the pen against her clipboard, that made me pause. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was more like a subtle declaration of intent. "I know what you're doing, and I could make your life difficult if I wanted to." From that day, I noticed little intrusions. A suggestion here about the angle of the solar panels, a casual question there about whether our driveway was too steep for the electrical lines. The comments were polite, almost friendly, but each one felt like a breadcrumb leading toward some inevitable confrontation. And yet, I didn't want to overreact. After all, we had lived here for years. We had invested time, energy, and money into making our house not just a shelter, but a home. Surely, a few awkward neighborly observations wouldn't turn into a full-blown conflict. But then the energy readings began to fluctuate. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. Our electricity usage numbers started spiking inexplicably. And the moment I noticed that the energy was being drawn when no one in our house was using it, the unease hit a new level. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was tapping into our system. It wasn't just about stolen electricity. It was the violation of privacy, the audacity of someone exploiting our home without permission. It felt personal, invasive, and infuriating. And slowly, I began connecting the dots. Karen, the questions, the subtle intrusions, the timing, it all pointed to her. That calm, picture-perfect exterior masked a controlling, calculating force that could turn the neighborhood into her stage, and our home into her latest prize. In those quiet moments, standing under the slanting light on our roof, I began to realize that this was going to be more than a minor HOA dispute or neighborly disagreement. This was a collision of principle, technology, and human ego. It would test patience, creativity, and the limits of what one person could endure while trying to defend what was rightfully theirs. And even as I felt the rising tension, a flicker of determination sparked in me. This wasn't just about electricity. It was about boundaries, respect, and finally, reclaiming control in a neighborhood that thrived on rules but not fairness. Community, which had once seemed a haven of quiet harmony, was now a minefield of subtle manipulations, unspoken judgments, and looming confrontations. And as the sun dipped behind the treetops, casting long shadows across our backyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that the next few weeks were going to change everything. The calm was about to break. Little did I know just how far Karen would go, how creative or audacious her interference could become. Little did I know how personal this would get, or how every move we made would escalate the tension to a boiling point. But for the first time, I felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Fear at the unknown, excitement at the chance to fight back. And as I stood there, hand on the edge of the panels, I silently vowed, whatever happened next, I wouldn't back down. Because sometimes, a quiet life in a peaceful neighborhood isn't about fitting in, it's about standing your ground when someone tries to take what isn't theirs. And this was just the beginning. The first few weeks after the initial incident felt like walking a tightrope. Every day I monitored the solar panels obsessively, watching the numbers flicker and fluctuate in ways that didn't make sense. There was no subtlety to Karen's interference anymore. She had found a rhythm, a way to tap into our energy when it suited her, and it was infuriating. But this was only the beginning. What started as a quiet theft soon turned into relentless harassment, rules being twisted, and a creeping sense that the entire HOA had shifted from oversight to outright intimidation. It began innocently enough, or at least in the way Karen presented it. An email from the HOA landed in my inbox one morning, subject line polite but loaded. Reminder: compliance with HOA standards and energy equipment regulations. The message was laced with warnings, suggesting that my solar panels might be non-compliant and that unapproved use could result in fines. I reread the message multiple times, trying to spot the specifics. None were provided. The language was vague, almost bureaucratic, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. A fine, I realized, wasn't a hypothetical it could climb into. The hundreds of dollars for something as simple as unauthorized energy access. I attempted to respond diplomatically, pointing out that all installations were approved, safe, and code compliant. My message was met with silence, followed a week later by another note, this time slightly sterner, emphasizing that HOA inspectors would be visiting the property to ensure adherence to community guidelines. The words were courteous, but the intent was clear. Someone had decided that I was in the wrong, and they were willing to use every administrative tool at their disposal to prove it. Then the personal digs began. Karen started stopping by under the guise of checking in, each visit increasingly invasive. She would linger near the driveway, commenting on my panels, the angle, even the placement of my trash cans. At first, it was subtle, almost absurdly polite. "We just want everyone's homes to look uniform," she'd say, flashing a practiced smile. But the undertone was unmistakable. Every word, every glance, every step was calculated to unsettle me, to remind me that she controlled the rules and had no hesitation enforcing them. Other neighbors began whispering. Some offered sympathetic looks, others careful smiles, but none dared confront her directly. It was as if everyone had learned that HOA Karen wielded her authority like a sword, and most preferred to keep their heads down. I felt isolated, trapped in a system that claimed to protect the community but seemed more invested in maintaining the illusion of order than justice. Each day my frustration mounted, a quiet storm building inside me that I could neither release nor ignore. Then the fines began. At first, they were small and arbitrary charge for an obstruction in the BFR community easement, which referred to the angle of our solar panels relative to the street. I challenged it, providing documentation, proof of compliance, but the HOA bureaucracy moved slowly, the response polite but dismissive. And then, almost immediately, another fine appeared, this time for a violation of landscape uniformity, targeting a small cluster of flowers I had planted along the driveway. It was petty, absurd, and designed to irritate, and it did. Every letter, every email, every unexpected visit ratcheted up the tension. I began spending more time at home, keeping a closer eye on the panels, checking security cameras, and even tracing the energy lines myself. Karen's interference wasn't just passive anymore, it was active, deliberate, and escalating. She dared to plug her Tesla in during peak hours, causing spikes in energy usage that were impossible to ignore. The more I resisted, the bolder she became, as if she knew that every act of defiance on my part fueled her sense of control. One afternoon, the situation reached a surreal level of absurdity. Karen arrived with the HOA inspector, clipboard in hand, and declared that our property energy connections needed immediate evaluation. I opened the door, bracing for confrontation, only to find them scrutinizing the panels as if they were alien devices, questioning my installation choices, and documenting every detail. It was humiliating, infuriating, and completely unnecessary. They measured angles, tapped on junction boxes, and wrote down notes with clinical detachment. All the while, Karen stood behind them, her gaze sharp, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips as if she had orchestrated this elaborate intrusion for her own amusement. I tried to remain calm, to explain, to assert that everything was legal and safe. But my words seemed to dissolve into the air, ignored or dismissed in favor of procedure, protocol, and Karen's ever-present scrutiny. Each passing minute felt like a battle I hadn't signed up for but couldn't escape. I realized bitterly that this wasn't just about energy or fines, it was about asserting dominance, making an example, and testing my limits. Even at home, peace was fleeting. Karen's interference wasn't limited to direct action. Notes appeared in the mailbox, passive-aggressive reminders about compliance, warnings about community standards, subtle threats masked as friendly suggestions. Every day, I felt the invisible weight of surveillance, the unspoken message that someone was watching, judging, and waiting for the smallest misstep. Our yard, our panels, even our daily routines were no longer our own, they had become stages for her power plays, arenas where my patience and resolve were constantly tested. Meanwhile, I began noticing the effect on Alex and Emily. Alex's quiet calm began to fray. He spent evenings researching HOA regulations, comparing legal codes, trying to anticipate the next arbitrary move. Emily, usually carefree, began hesitating before riding her skateboard or inviting friends over, sensing the tension in our home, the constant undercurrent of threat. It was devastating to realize that Karen's petty actions were not just inconveniencing me. They were permeating every corner of our family life, a shadow creeping over the home we had worked so hard to make safe and welcoming. Tension escalated further when a small confrontation erupted during a neighborhood meeting. Karen, ever meticulous, had prepared a presentation highlighting community compliance issues, subtly including our home without naming us directly. As she spoke, I could feel the eyes of other residents flick toward me, measuring, judging, anticipating. It was a thinly veiled public shaming, a calculated humiliation disguised as civic duty. My blood boiled, my heart raced, and for a moment, I wondered how far she could push before someone finally called her out. But nobody did, because nobody dared. Back at home, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I upgraded the monitoring on the panels, tracking every kilowatt, every connection, every anomaly. I reviewed HOA rules obsessively, searching for loopholes, small details that could be leveraged. It wasn't enough just to observe anymore. I had to anticipate, strategize, and prepare for the inevitable escalation. And it did come one evening. As I sat reviewing energy data, I noticed a spike that couldn't be explained by any normal household use. Someone was drawing power again. My heart pounded. This time, it was obvious. Karen's Tesla was charging, and she had somehow timed it perfectly to coincide with our peak output. The audacity was staggering. I wanted to confront her immediately, but a deeper instinct warned patience. I needed to gather evidence, to document everything, to ensure that when the confrontation came, it would be undeniable. The days that followed were a blur of tension, observation, and strategy. Each action she took felt like a direct challenge, and each response I prepared seemed to anticipate her next move. I could almost feel the electricity in the air, not just from the panels, but from the conflict itself, thickening, charging, waiting for the inevitable storm. By now, the neighborhood had become a chessboard. Every interaction was a move, every email a maneuver, every casual visit a potential threat. Karen had escalated from subtle digs to overt interference, and I realized that this wasn't simply about solar energy, it was about control, pride, and the unspoken hierarchy of power in our community. She wanted to dominate, to humiliate, to prove that she could bend the rules, manipulate people, and assert authority over those who had worked quietly to live honestly. And then, the cliffhanger arrived in the form of an unexpected notice. Another HOA letter appeared, this one stamped with urgency, threatening legal action for unapproved energy usage and unauthorized connections. It was formal, cold, and unmistakably serious. This wasn't a suggestion anymore, it was a threat that carried real consequences. I stared at the letter, realizing that the situation had spiraled further than I had anticipated. The energy theft, the fines, the harassment, and the intimidation had all led to this moment. A confrontation was coming. A public, undeniable clash. With HOA Karen and her army of rules, and there was no turning back. As I read the notice over and over, a sense of determination surged through me. This wasn't just about electricity, solar panels, or petty fines anymore. This was about standing my ground, defending my family, and proving that no one, no matter how polished, well-connected, or entitled, had the right to invade my home, manipulate the rules, or disrupt my life. And deep down, I knew that the next few days would push everything to the edge of frustration, anger, and anticipation. The edge where calculated patience meets explosive action, and the outcome is impossible to predict. And so I waited, watched, and prepared. The storm was building, invisible to most, but impossible to ignore. Every beep of the meter, every spike in energy usage, every glance from a passing neighbor reminded me that the world we thought we knew, peaceful, cooperative community, was gone. In its place was a battlefield of rules, egos, and relentless determination. And when the storm finally hit, there would be no turning back. The air in the community clubhouse felt heavy, suffocating almost, as if the walls themselves were straining to hold back the tension boiling inside. The folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, some leaning forward in eager anticipation, others whispering behind cupped hands. The faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed like static in the silence before a storm. David Miller sat near the front, shoulders squared, documents clutched in his hands, his heart thundering in rhythm with the electric anticipation of what was about to unfold. For weeks, he had endured the petty harassment, the violation notices, the whispered gossip, the stolen energy. Tonight was not just another HOA meeting. Tonight was the breaking point, the place where years of carefully disguised control and abuse would be dragged into the light for everyone to see. At the far end of the table, Karen Thompson sat like a queen presiding over her court. Her blonde bob was perfectly in place, her pearl earrings glinting under the sterile lights, her cardigan neatly draped over her shoulders as though she had prepared for the cameras that weren't even there. Her eyes flicked over the crowd with the quiet arrogance of someone who had always gotten her way. To her left, 2 HOA board members sat stiffly, their faces unreadable, though the tension in their shoulders betrayed them. To her right, another board member fiddled nervously with a pen, tapping it against the tabletop in an irregular beat that seemed to sync with the pulse of the room. When the meeting began, Karen's voice was smooth, deliberate, almost sweet. As she welcomed everyone in that condescending tone she had mastered over years of neighborhood dominance. She skimmed quickly over budget updates, landscaping schedules, and pool maintenance concerns, as though rushing through the trivialities to get to the main event, the issue of known compliance that she had built this evening around. Her smile widened when she called David's name. "All right, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice ringing out with feigned politeness. "We need to address your ongoing violations and the inappropriate use of community resources." A ripple ran through the crowd. Heads turned. Murmurs rose. David stood slowly, the papers in his hand trembling not from fear, but from the restrained fury of weeks of injustice. He felt the weight of every violation notice shoved into his mailbox. Every smirk Karen had given as she walked past his driveway with her Tesla silently humming from his solar grid. Every rumor she had planted like poison among the neighbors. He cleared his throat and locked his eyes on her. "With all due respect," David began, his voice calm but carrying, "the violations you keep citing are not violations at all. They're fabrications. And the real violation, the one you don't want anyone to see, is sitting right in your driveway every single night." A hush fell over the room. Karen's smile faltered, just slightly, but she leaned forward, masking the twitch of irritation with a tilt of her head. "Excuse me?" she said, feigning confusion. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Mr. Miller, but we are here to discuss your known compliance." "Not? Oh no," David interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through her pretense. "We are here to discuss the truth, and I've brought proof." He laid the first document on the table, a detailed log of his solar meter readings, times and dates, cross-referenced with neighborhood camera footage of Karen's Tesla parked conveniently close to his grid access point. The papers made a sharp smack as they hit the table, and the sound echoed through the room like a gavel. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen stiffened in her chair, her knuckles whitening around the pen she gripped. David didn't stop. He pulled out photographs, each one time-stamped, showing the unmistakable sight of her car plugged into his system. The projector flickered to life as he handed the images to a board member who reluctantly set them up for display on the wall. One by one, the evidence flashed across the screen. Karen's smug face in the background, her Tesla cable trailing like a thief's rope into his property line. "This isn't just a nuisance," David continued, his voice gaining momentum as whispers swirled around him. "This is theft. Theft of energy I worked and paid for. Theft that has cost me hundreds of dollars and countless hours of stress. And while I've been fined and harassed for imaginary violations, the real offender has been sitting at the head of this table, hiding behind her title." The room erupted into murmurs, some shocked, some outraged, some nodding in recognition of what they had long suspected but never dared to say. A few neighbors leaned forward eagerly, whispering, "I knew it. I knew she was up to something." Karen's face hardened. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle sound that rang false. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her sweet tone cracking into sharpness. "This is nothing but fabricated nonsense from a man who has been antagonistic since the day he joined this community. You're grasping at straws, Mr. Miller. And? Frankly, it's pathetic." But her voice wavered. Her confidence, for the first time, fractured. And David saw it, the flicker of fear in her eyes, the crack in her armor. He pressed forward. "I anticipated you would say that," he said, pulling out the final piece of evidence. A statement from the utility company verifying abnormal energy draw patterns, traced directly to his home's grid access during the exact hours Karen's car had been charging. He slammed it on the table with finality, the sound echoing like thunder. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned in, whispering urgently to another. The murmurs in the crowd rose to a low roar. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson as she gripped her papers tighter, her composure unraveling under the weight of undeniable proof. "This is not just about me," David said, his voice rising above the noise, steady and strong. "This is about every single person here who has ever been bullied, fined, or silenced under the excuse of rules that don't apply equally to everyone. This is about a system that has been abused for one person's control, and tonight we end it." The crowd erupted, no longer murmuring but speaking out loud, voices overlapping. "He's right. We're tired of this. Enough is enough." The swell of collective frustration that had been building in silence for years now burst into the open. Karen slammed her hand on the table, her pearls trembling against her earlobes as her voice rose in desperation. "This meeting is out of order. None of this is admissible. None of this is." But her words drowned beneath the voices of neighbors who had been waiting for someone brave enough to speak. The tide had turned, and she could feel it pulling her down. One board member finally cleared his throat, his voice steady but edged with guilt. "Mrs. Thompson, with this evidence, it's clear we have to launch an official inquiry into your conduct, effective immediately." The room exploded, some cheering, some gasping, all united in the shocking realization that the queen of the HOA was no longer untouchable. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time, her smug mask had shattered, leaving her exposed, humiliated, and powerless in front of the very people she had once ruled. David stood tall, chest heaving with adrenaline, his eyes locked on hers. He didn't gloat, didn't smile, he simply let the silence speak for itself as Karen sat frozen, her reign crumbling in the fluorescent glare of the clubhouse lights. This was the moment everything changed. The years of petty fines, the endless gossip, the stolen energy, the manipulation, all of it had led here, to the night when truth finally outweighed intimidation, when the balance of power shifted once and for all. And yet, as David stood there in the eye of the storm, a single thought coursed through his mind, sharp and unfinished. What comes after this? Because when the dust settled, one thing was certain: Karen's downfall was only the beginning. When the storm finally broke, it was as swift as it was decisive. For weeks, I had been pushed, harassed, and boxed in by endless rules, unfair fines, and the audacity of someone who believed she was untouchable. But Karen had underestimated one thing: patience. While she schemed, while she siphoned power and wielded her HOA authority like a weapon, I had been documenting everything. Every unexplained spike in my solar output, every late-night charge to her Tesla, every letter, every notice, every smug glance when she thought she had me cornered. And when the time came to respond, I wasn't going in blind. I was walking in with evidence, undeniable, irrefutable proof that the very person accusing me of unauthorized energy use was guilty of it herself. The turning point came at the HOA board hearing. Karen had pushed for it aggressively, claiming my panels were unapproved, unsafe, and non-compliant. She came prepared with her usual confidence, armed with binders of printouts and rules highlighted in neon yellow. But this time, I was prepared too. With a calmness that surprised even me, I laid out my case. I showed the data logs from my solar system, the security camera footage, and the time-stamped records of power spikes that coincided perfectly with her car being in the driveway. Piece by piece, I dismantled the narrative she had tried to build, exposing the theft, the hypocrisy, and the lengths she had gone to manipulate the system. For the first time, the smug smile faded from her face. And as murmurs rippled through the room, I could see the cracks forming in her carefully curated persona. She had built her power on intimidation and the assumption that nobody would dare challenge her. But now, in front of the very people she had spent years controlling, the truth was undeniable. The evidence was too detailed, too damning, too precise to ignore. The board had no choice but to act. Not only were the fines against me dismissed, but Karen herself was formally censured for abusing her position, misusing HOA authority, and tampering with private property. Her access to the board was suspended, pending further review, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood saw what she really was: not a leader, not a protector of community standards, but a bully who had finally been caught. The fallout was immediate. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now came forward, quietly sharing their own stories of being targeted, fined, or manipulated by Karen. People who had whispered in private now spoke openly, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally stood up and won. The illusion of her control shattered, and the community began to breathe a little easier. Free from the constant pressure of her surveillance and selective enforcement. At home, the change was even more profound. For the first time in months, I could walk into my driveway without scanning for hidden intrusions. The solar panels stood quietly, humming with the energy of the sun, untouched, unchallenged, and rightfully ours. Alex, who had spent so many nights buried in documents and regulations, finally set the paperwork aside, smiling in relief. Emily's laughter returned to the driveway, her skateboard wheels rattling against the pavement without hesitation. The shadows that had stretched over our home slowly began to lift, replaced by the simple peace we had once taken for granted. But the victory wasn't just personal. It sent a message, one that echoed through every household in our neighborhood. Rules are meant to protect, not to oppress. Communities are meant to support, not to control. And no single person, no matter how entitled or relentless, should ever be allowed to weaponize authority for their own gain. Of course, Karen didn't disappear quietly. She lingered on the edges of the community, her influence diminished but not gone, her pride wounded but not entirely broken. Occasionally, I would catch her gaze across the street, a flicker of resentment in her eyes. But the power dynamic had shifted. She knew, and everyone else knew, that her grip was gone. The board watched her carefully, the neighbors no longer cowered, and I no longer felt the weight of her intimidation pressing down on my family. The months that followed were calmer, steadier, almost surreal in their normalcy. The HOA meetings, once dominated by Karen's voice, became more balanced, more collaborative. Rules still existed, but they were applied fairly, without bias or hidden agendas. Neighbors began working together again, sharing ideas, supporting each other instead of living in quiet fear of the next violation notice. For the first time in years, it felt like a community, not a dictatorship. Looking back, I realized that the entire ordeal had been about more than just stolen electricity. It had been about boundaries, about the right to protect what's yours, about the importance of standing up even when it feels easier to stay silent. It had been about resilience, patience, and the courage to push back against unfairness, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The experience had tested me in ways I never expected. It had drained me, frustrated me, and pushed me to the edge of my patience. But it had also forced me to grow, to find a strength I didn't know I had, to protect my family and my home with everything in me. And in the end, that was what made the victory so much sweeter, not just the defeat of Karen, but the reclamation of peace, pride, and control over the place we called home. Today, when I look at those solar panels, I don't just see clean energy. I see a reminder of what it means to fight for what's right, to endure when it's easier to give in, and to prove that no matter how powerful someone seems, no one is untouchable when faced with truth. And maybe that's the real lesson here, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever felt cornered by unfair rules, targeted by those who thrive on control, or silenced by fear of retaliation. Because the truth is, the moment you stand your ground, the illusion of their power begins to crumble. And once it crumbles, there's no going back. So as I sit here, the hum of the panels steady and familiar, I can't help but wonder, how many other neighborhoods, how many other communities are living under the shadow of their own HOA Karens? How many people are suffering in silence, convinced they're powerless against petty authority? And how many could find freedom, peace, and pride again if only they stood up and said, "Enough"? That's the legacy of this fight, the impact. That lingers long after the confrontation is over. It wasn't just about electricity. It was about justice, community, and the simple, stubborn belief that no one has the right to take what isn't theirs. And in the end, when the lights dim, when the rules fade, and when the noise of conflict finally quiets down, that belief is all you need to reclaim what's rightfully yours.